They cut me out of the family business, thinking they'd silence me forever. They had no idea I was about to become their biggest competitor. What happens next will leave you speechless. They cut me out of the family business on a Thursday morning. The memory is sharp, like glass pressed into my skin. I can still smell the faint sting of cheap cologne in the air, mixed with burnt coffee that sat forgotten on the sideboard, and the crisp tang of fresh ink drying on papers already waiting for my signature. Or, more accurately, my dismissal. I walked into the boardroom expecting a routine meeting, but the silence that greeted me was too heavy, too rehearsed. My brother sat at the head of the table, leaning back in the leather chair that used to belong to our father. His cuffs were fastened with the old silver links, our father's cufflinks, the same ones I'd watch him polish by hand every Sunday before church. My brother rolled his wrist as though they had always belonged to him, tapping his finger against the armrest with a rhythm that betrayed his nerves. Around him, my cousins filled the room, men I had grown up with, men who had once wrestled with me in the yard and shared bread at my table. Now, not one of them could meet my eyes. The lawyer, a thin man with glasses that slid constantly down his nose, cleared his throat. His voice cracked at first, as if even he knew what he was about to say was crooked. By unanimous vote, he began, reading from a sheet of paper as though it were a sermon he did not believe. You are hereby removed from your position and any future profit sharing within the company. He paused, glancing at my brother as though seeking permission to continue. This decision, he went on, is in the best interest of growth and modernization. My brother leaned forward then, lacing his fingers together. His smile was tight, rehearsed. It's nothing personal, he said, though every word dripped with insincerity. We just think your cautious style doesn't fit where we're heading. Times are changing. We need sharper, faster moves. Another cousin spoke up, his voice unsteady but firm enough to be counted. You're too traditional, he added. We can't keep running things like it's 20 years ago. You don't understand the new strategies. I sat there with my hands folded neatly on the polished table, my face calm, though inside, something was shifting. Their words struck with the weight of betrayal, but I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Lies wrapped in silk words. They dressed it up as business, but I could see it for what it was, fear and greed, hiding behind a mask of progress. The lawyer droned on, listing clauses and signatures, the kind of words that sound official but hollow. As he read, I let my eyes drift. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, louder than usual, a metronome to the betrayal unfolding. My brother avoided my gaze, but when I looked at him, I could see the triumph flickering in his eyes, the kind of satisfaction that only comes when a man finally believes he has stepped out of another's shadow. He mistook my silence for surrender. When the final words were spoken, the room fell into a tense stillness. My brother stood, extending his hand across the table. I looked at it for a moment, his fingers steady, but his eyes betraying the question lingering inside him. Would I fight? Would I resist? I reached out and shook his hand. My grip was firm, deliberate. Understood, I said simply, my voice even free of tremor. That was the moment they all relaxed, exhaling as though danger had passed. They believed my silence meant weakness. They thought the war was already won. I rose from my chair, adjusted my jacket, and walked out of the room without another word. Behind me, I heard whispers, the shuffling of papers, the lawyer's pen scratching across contracts. They thought they had buried me. What they didn't realize was that they had simply unchained me. As I drove home through the crowded streets, my thoughts did not race with anger. Instead, they moved with cold precision. Images surfaced, my brother and I as boys, lifting crates in the summer heat of the warehouse. I remembered the sweat dripping down my back as I worked double shifts while he slipped away to nap in the office or sneak off with friends. I remembered the way he would return later, brushing dust onto his shirt to look as though he had worked as hard as me. Even then, I had seen the hunger in his eyes, the need to take credit without effort. My father had trusted us both, but I knew, and maybe my brother knew too, that my father trusted me more. Perhaps that was the wound that never healed. Perhaps that was why he needed me gone, because every time I stood beside him, I reminded him of the man he could never become. When I reached home, the sun was already low, throwing long shadows across the walls. I poured myself a drink, the glass cool in my hand, and sat by the window overlooking the city. The streets below bustled with life. Men chasing paychecks, boys shouting on corners, trucks roaring down the avenues. I sat in silence, watching the lights flicker against the darkening sky. I felt no rage, no desperation. What I felt was sharper, colder. They had cut me out, yes. They had taken my share, my name, my place in the company that bore my father's sweat. But in doing so, they had freed me. For the first time, I was no longer bound by loyalty to the family. I no longer had to cover their mistakes, shield them from consequences, or carry their dead weight. I was free to compete, free to build something they could never imagine. And as I set the empty glass down on the table beside me, I already knew exactly where to begin. They had cut me out, yes, but what they didn't realize was that in doing so, they had given me freedom. I was no longer bound by loyalty to the family. I no longer had to protect them from their own mistakes. I was free to compete, free to build something they could never imagine. And I knew exactly where to begin. I didn't rush. Revenge is not served hot. It is crafted in silence, like an architect laying blueprints. My first step was simple, a small office on the far side of town, hidden in plain sight. The building was nothing impressive, just red brick stained with decades of rain, its narrow windows letting in pale shafts of light that fell across cracked linoleum floors. Inside, I had four walls, a second-hand desk, and a phone with a coiled cord that curled like a snake. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. And from that quiet room, I began to lay the foundation of something greater than the empire they had stolen from me. Every morning, I came early, coffee in hand, and sat at that desk with a notebook and a stack of old ledgers. The silence of the room sharpened my thoughts. I dial numbers, one by one, suppliers, drivers, clients. Men I had known for years. Men who remember me not as a name on paper, but as the man who stood with them in warehouses, sleeves rolled up, making sure shipments were right. I didn't beg. I didn't try to lure them with false promises. I simply reminded them of how we once did business, fair and honest. "Good to hear your voice again," one supplier said, his tone gruff but warm. "You always paid on time. You never shaved a man's worth." "That hasn't changed," I told him. My voice was calm, steady, the voice of a man who knew where he was headed. "If you bring me the work, I'll honor it. No tricks, no shortcuts." Slowly they came. One at a time, men placed their trust in me again. It wasn't the avalanche my brother feared. It was a steady drip, a quiet erosion. Brick by brick, I was laying down my future. Meanwhile, I studied. Every night, I pored over financial reports my family company released. The numbers told a story louder than words. My brother spent more than he earned, bragging to investors about expansions that didn't exist, promising returns he could never secure. I clipped articles from newspapers, kept copies of every interview he gave. In them, he puffed his chest and spoke about vision and growth, but I knew the truth. Behind the curtain, he was bleeding money. Behind the applause, he was stacking debt. I watched him from a distance. Industry events brought us into the same halls, the same crowded auditoriums. I never avoided him. I walked past him with a polite nod, sometimes even offering a measured smile. He always laughed when he saw me, too loud, too forced, as though he needed the crowd to hear it. "So, you're still playing with that little side project of yours?" he said once, clapping my shoulder harder than he needed to. His cufflinks glimmered under the lights, but I saw the tightness in his jaw. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Silence can wound deeper than words, and his laugh carried the faint crack of unease. At night, when the office was quiet, I sometimes thought of my father. I imagined him sitting across from me, the way he once had when I was a boy. His voice echoed in memory. "Patience is the sharpest weapon a man can wield. Don't fight the storm. Stand still and let it tear itself apart." Those words became my anchor. While my brother charged forward like a man drunk on speed, I moved slow and steady, step after deliberate step. I remembered another lesson. one that returned like a lantern in the dark. Years ago, a supplier had brought in a shipment that was short by half. My brother, eager to keep things moving, told me to sign the papers anyway. "No one will notice," he whispered, his eyes darting nervously. But I refused. I sent the truck back, even when it cost us time. That night, my father pulled me aside. His weathered hands rested on my shoulders, his eyes burning with pride. "Integrity is expensive, son," he said, "but it always pays." Those words carved themselves into me. And as I began to build my own company, I carried them like scripture. 2 years passed this way. My office grew busier, phone calls longer, contracts heavier. I kept my head down, let the work speak for itself. Soon, I had more than just a desk and a phone. I had a warehouse larger than the one I had grown up in, its walls echoing with the sound of forklifts, engines, and men calling orders. Trucks rolled out with my company's name stamped in bold letters on their sides, a quiet declaration that I was no longer an exile, I was a rival. Word of my success reached my brother, of course. At first, he dismissed it. He laughed when he heard I had started over, dismissing me as a small annoyance, a gnat buzzing near his feast. But laughter, I knew, can hide unease. Behind that grin, behind his boasts at parties, there was something brittle in his eyes. We crossed paths again at a banquet hosted by the trade association. The hall was filled with chandeliers and polished wood floors, the air thick with cigar smoke and ambition. He spotted me across the room and raised his glass, calling out loud enough for others to hear. "Building your little warehouse, are you?" he said, his voice playful but sharp. "You'll give me a run for my money in about, 20 years? I smiled faintly, nodded, and turned back to my drink. His laughter echoed across the hall, but I noticed how his hand tightened around his glass, the knuckles widening. He needed everyone to believe he wasn't threatened, but deep down he was. Each time our eyes met in those years, I saw it, the flicker of unease, the shadow of doubt. He had underestimated me. He had thought cutting me out would silence me. Instead, I had grown louder without ever raising my voice. And though I never said it out loud, I knew the truth. He was afraid. 2 years passed quietly. My new business grew steady, brick by brick, contract by contract. I never bragged, never boasted. I let the work speak. Soon, I had a warehouse bigger than the one my family owned, and trucks with my company's name rolling through the city. My brother noticed, of course, but he thought it was just a small annoyance, something beneath his attention. He laughed when he heard I had started over. But behind that laugh, I knew he was uneasy. I could see it in his eyes when we passed each other at industry events. He had underestimated me, and deep down, he was afraid. The breaking point came sooner than I expected. By the 3rd year, the numbers told a story sharper than any blade. Every contract I won was another nail in the coffin of the empire my brother once paraded as unshakable. His trucks no longer carried the same weight across the highways. The warehouses that once buzzed with the sound of moving crates and forklifts began to echo with silence. I could almost feel the panic in his boardroom from miles away. Half his contracts, gone, taken by me. Suppliers who once bowed to him now sat in my office with careful smiles, promising loyalty. Clients who once laughed at me behind closed doors now call me first. His debts grew louder than his voice, and the men he had built his throne on began to whisper about leaving him stranded. I knew then that what I had set into motion was working, and yet, instead of triumph, I felt a stillness inside me, a kind of cold satisfaction, the kind that doesn't erupt in cheers but settles in the bones like a winter wind. News traveled fast. A friend at the bank told me investors were talking, quietly at first, but with more urgency every week. They were asking questions about his balance sheets, about his disappearing reserves, about why his promises suddenly seemed hollow. The man who once strode into meetings wearing our father's cufflinks now avoided eye contact with his own managers. And I waited. Then one evening my phone rang. The number that appeared was familiar, though I hadn't seen it in years. I hesitated before answering, knowing full well what this call meant. "Hello," I said evenly, leaning back in my chair. A shaky breath rattled through the speaker before the voice came. "It's me," my cousin said, his tone hushed, almost ashamed. I I need to talk to you. I smiled faintly. This was the same cousin who had once stood with my brother in that fateful boardroom, the same one who cast his vote against me without hesitation. I could still see him in my memory, arms crossed, chin high, pretending his betrayal was just business. What about? I asked, letting silence stretch in the spaces between my words. His throat cleared nervously. Your brother. Things aren't going well. Investors are threatening to pull out. Suppliers are gone. He's not the man he used to be. We were thinking maybe it's time for a merger. A family reunion, you know? Put everything back together again. For the sake of blood. The desperation in his voice almost made me laugh, but I kept my face blank, my voice calm. You want me to rescue him? I said, stating the truth he didn't dare admit. There was a pause. Then, with a bitter exhale, he whispered, yes. I stood and walked to the window, staring at the city lights burning in the night. His voice on the other end was small, trembling, like a child begging forgiveness. I thought of the night they threw me out, the smirk on my brother's face, the way the room had applauded as though I had been defeated for good. Now here was his messenger, broken and pleading. I don't merge with men who once thought I was disposable, I said softly, every syllable deliberate, meant to cut. The silence that followed was heavier than words. Then came the faint sound of his breath shaking, and without another word, he hung up. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and returned to my desk. I knew my cousin would carry that message straight to my brother's ears, and I wanted him to, but I wasn't finished. For 3 years, I had built more than contracts and clients. I had built a quiet arsenal. Every shady deal my brother made, every manipulated report, every reckless loan, I had traced it, documented it, filed it away with patience. It wasn't illegal, not enough to drag him into court, but it was enough to expose him for what he was, a reckless fraud who lived on borrowed time. I didn't storm the press with it. I didn't need spectacle. Instead, I moved like water, quiet and steady, seeping into the right cracks. Banks received files slipped into anonymous envelopes. Auditors found papers delivered to their inboxes with no sender attached. Suppliers who doubted his ability to pay were handed evidence confirming their fears. I never signed my name to any of it. I didn't need to. Weeks turned into months, and I watched as the foundation crumbled. Trucks stopped moving, rusting in empty lots. Warehouses that once overflowed stood hollow, the echo of footsteps bouncing against bare walls. Workers lined up outside offices, demanding paychecks that never came. And my brother, once the golden sun, was nowhere to be seen. Rumors reached me in fragments. He had sold his car. He had mortgaged his house. He had even pawned the cufflinks our father once wore at the head of the table, the very ones he flaunted when he took my seat from me. It was his last act of desperation, a final trade of pride for survival. But no matter what he sold, no matter how he begged, it was over. I thought often of that night when they cast me out, how he smiled as though the world belonged to him and him alone. Now that smile was gone. His empire, the very throne he cut me out for, had turned to dust in his hands. He had thought I was nothing, that I was replaceable, forgettable, disposable. But in truth, I had been the lifeline all along. And when he cut me away, he cut himself off from the only thing that kept him alive. He had cut me out thinking he was building his throne. Instead, he had cut himself off from the lifeline that had kept him alive all along me. I never gloated. I never stood in front of him and declared victory. That wasn't necessary. The silence of his downfall spoke louder than any words I could have thrown. I remember the last time I saw him in person. It was at a shareholders' meeting where his voice used to dominate the room. He walked in with his chest puffed up as though nothing had changed, but his eyes betrayed him. They were restless, darting toward the faces of men who once nodded at his every word but now avoided his gaze. I sat quietly at the end of the table, saying little, letting the weight of silence press down on him. He knew the walls were closing in. When the meeting ended, I didn't need to say a thing. He brushed past me, his jaw tight, his steps quick and uneven. His shoes clicked against the marble floor like the rhythm of a retreat. That sound still echoes in my mind. His retreat, his surrender, without a single word spoken. One day, Not long after, I drove past the old family warehouse. The building rose in the distance like a ghost from another life. Its sign, once bold and bright, had faded into a dull shadow of itself. The glass windows were cracked, some broken entirely, jagged edges catching the pale light of the setting sun. Weeds grew wild at the edges of the lot, reclaiming the space that once buzzed with life and movement. I pulled the car to the side of the road and sat there for a long moment, engine humming softly beneath me. My hands rested on the steering wheel, though I wasn't driving anymore. I could see myself as a boy, running through those doors during summers, carrying crates, sweating under the heavy air of hard work. My father would stand at the entrance with his arms crossed, not in judgment, but in pride. He used to smile at the sight of his sons working side by side, his voice carrying encouragement across the warehouse floor. A lump rose in my throat as I sat there, staring at the ruin of what once defined us. My reflection in the cracked windshield looked older, harder, but also steadier. I swallowed the lump down. What was lost could not be regained. That time, that unity, that innocence, it was gone. But what could be corrected, what could be set right, had been corrected. I stepped out of the car and walked up to the chain-link fence that now stood around the property. My fingers curled around the rusted metal, the coolness biting into my skin. A stray breeze carried the smell of dust and old wood, a reminder of the years buried beneath silence. For a brief moment, I thought I heard the echo of voices, my brothers laughing, my father calling orders, but the sound died quickly, swallowed by the stillness. A voice startled me. "You shouldn't linger here." I turned. An older man, a night guard, leaned against the small shack by the gate. His uniform was faded, his cap tilted low. He eyed me carefully, as though he knew I didn't belong there anymore. "I used to work here," I said softly, my voice carrying more weight than I intended. The guard studied me for a moment, then nodded, as if he understood. "Used to be a good place," he murmured, his tone filled with a quiet sadness. "Now it's nothing but a hollow shell." I didn't reply. I simply gave him a small nod and walked back to my car. My footsteps felt heavy on the gravel, each one carrying the weight of memory and loss. Back in my office now, things are different. The hum of the lights, the quiet shuffle of papers, the muted ring of a distant phone. All of it feels alive, steady, built on a foundation no one could shake. The company I sit in now is mine. Not borrowed, not handed down, not stolen. Built. Every inch of it shaped by my own hands, my own patience, my own faith. The men who once betrayed me are gone, scattered like ash in the wind. Some tried to start over and failed. Others turned on one another, consumed by the greed that once gave them strength. I watched from a distance, not with malice, but with clarity. They broke themselves, and I, cut out, forgotten, discarded, stand stronger than ever. Sometimes, late in the evening, I look out the tall windows of my office at the city below. The skyline flickers with countless lights, each one a reminder of ambition and struggle. I think about what it cost me to stand here now. The betrayals, the nights of doubt, the quiet hours when I wondered if I would ever rise again. And yet here I am. I do not hate them anymore. Hate is too heavy to carry. It poisons the heart and clouds the mind. I've seen men destroy themselves with it. Instead, I carry something else, a calm truth, a weightless certainty. The truth is simple, and it is enough. They cut me out of the family business, and I became their biggest competitor. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of betrayal, resilience, and the ultimate triumph over injustice in the corporate world. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of self-reliance, the power of a long-term plan, and the consequences of underestimating a determined individual.